Good evening and welcome to what is going to be quite an amazing sort of probably the next 40 days in terms of what we go in our trading world. Just before I get started, just for some admin, if you are logged in as a guest and are watching this as an attendee, on your right hand side you have got your GoToWebinar control panel. There is a couple of panels there. One of them says questions. I'm one of those people that really likes to make sure that as we go along, we answer questions. So if you've got a question to talk to me about, please don't hesitate to whack it in there straight away. It will pop up. I will be able to see it, and I'll probably want to answer it pretty much straight away because it'll add to this discussion. Because this, and let's go before we go any further, this is a discussion. The most amazing thing about what is happening with the US presidential election for 2020 is we have never seen in living memory anything like it with regards to the amount of risk events, clearly COVID-19 and what that means for it, a bombastic president that we never thought we were going to have, and how that actually now feeds into this story as well. What it also means for your trading, because your trading clearly is being impacted by so many different factors. And I'll come to that and when we go through with it. Tonight's one, we are going to be very much looking at the history of what the debates mean for the election themselves, history around how the trades sort of play out, then also the themes that are going to come out in this election over pretty much the next 40 days. Now, they've already been developing, and I know you understand that, but it's more around going forward, how do we actually use that to our advantage? How do we probably position ourselves going through what happens for, if you are watching this has been done on the Tuesday night before the actual election here in Australia. It's up at around about 11 a.m. Australian Eastern Standard Time. But please check wherever you are in the world, please check where you are with that regards to those times. But we will go through a sole history of them. I'm going to do 5 of these. This is the first one. I want to go through a history of the election, but also the events that are going to really matter over the next 40 days, leading into the second and third presidential debate, the actual election itself and what happens on the day. The advantage of being in Australia with the US presidential election is that everything that happens with regards to results coming out, which are in the evening in the US, will be in the middle of the day for us. So on the 4th of November, when we're all awake and at work or at our desk doing trading, you'll actually get to see this live come in. That's the biggest advantage that we have in this country, is that you will be able to actually live trade this, live movement, watch the momentum. I remember 2016 like it was yesterday. I remember sitting at my desk at a trading floor, and it was just the most amazing thing in terms of what happened. Because do remember, initially, the initial reaction to seeing Trump getting voted in was actually quite negative. The initial on the day reaction was like, oh my God, he's going to win. He's going to get in. And markets didn't know what to do. You saw FX go all over the shot. Dixie went through the roof in one direction, then fell again. But if you look in the pairs, you saw euro dollar just do this most amazing whipsaw actions. And then all of a sudden the next day, it all calmed down because people went, well, hang on a minute, these policies are really quite stimulatory, very, very positive economically, and away we've gone. So before I go any further though, don't forget, please have a very read of this. Everything that I'm going to talk about today is completely general in nature, particularly with the topic we're talking about, and particularly looking at FX over the next 40 days. We just can't know your personal scenario. You need to be fully aware that there is clear risk with what's going on, and therefore, when you are doing your trades, it is on your own accord. So do remember, general in nature, none of this is personal advice. FP Markets doesn't know your scenario at all. So just remember that this is about giving you things and ideas, giving you possible outcomes to certain things. But in the end, I will put my hand up very clearly and say this: we've never gone through a scenario like what we're going through. COVID-19 has added another nth degree to what is happening, and that's what makes this so interesting. Quite an interesting time to be trading, no doubt about that. I think it's quite an interesting time, but it is, as I said on screen, a risk. So let's start with that. Let's roll back and actually genuinely start with this. You don't have to be a political expert. You don't have to be a political scientist. You don't even need to be a person that completely understands the US. You just need to understand that there's a few things that are sitting where we sit. So I apologize to those of you overseas, but I'm going to assume that most of you watching this on replay are in Australia, so that I can sort of give you a bit of a background to it. In the US, they have what they call their college vote, the electoral college system. It's different to the Westminster system, which we're used to in Australia or in the UK, but it is similar in the idea that, like in Australia, you need a certain amount of seats to pass the line to get you over there. In the college votes, you need 270. So that's what, apologies. That's what this figure here is talking about. This is where you need to win. And interesting enough, and I'll show this chart in a minute, the narrowing of the polls is getting there. But clearly, you can see at the moment expectation, and this chart I've taken actually off Politico. It's a very, very, very good US political website. And what it's doing, it's collating all of the recent polls into one and gives you that there. You can see, and what I'm also going to do with this series, I'm going to make some videos about states that actually matter. The six that you really need to look at: Florida, Pennsylvania. Don't worry about Georgia. Don't worry about North Carolina. They're not going to really make a difference. They are likely to swing towards Trump. And it's interesting that they're actually considering here a toss-up. I would not say that. They're leaning towards a Trump scenario, but Ohio is definitely in play. You've then got to look at these two. Michigan and Wisconsin, they are big, interesting ones. These are your Rust Belt, your GM Ford stuff, along with places like going into Detroit. I get that, but your Rust Belt in here, these 5 main states in here, and you never look at what goes on in Illinois or what have you, but Wisconsin, Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, these are big players. And the reason I say that is that this number is the amount of college votes that they give. They are the ones to watch. The only other one to watch that I'd also point out is Arizona, and probably also you could probably throw in Nevada. It's interesting to say that Nevada has started to be a flip-flop state. Once upon a time, you'd say it was Republican. Now it's a flip-flop state, or what they refer to in the US as a purple state. Obviously, blue and red added together equals purple. The reason Florida, Pennsylvania, Ohio probably matter, apologies, I'm having fun with my mouse here, is the amount of college votes that come with it. Trump needs, in fact, he has to grab hold of a minimum of probably Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Michigan to actually hold on, because it's looking more and more likely that Florida will probably actually go towards Biden. There are other movements in here that are suggesting it towards Biden, and that's where you're starting to get these numbers up. And there are some polls that actually got Biden pretty much already over the line, because he's got such a bigger distance to make up Trump in terms of where they sit. But they're the ones that I would point out to you, and I'll do a series about it. But why that all matters is that these states, their voting system, what they could come down to and how they do things is becoming quite convoluted. It's also the fact that we've now got COVID in there. Do people actually get out and vote? It's a great question. Most expect people will, even with what's going on. You've also got a scenario where realistically, Pennsylvania is the one I'd always highlight. Almost to a point, you could actually draw a line straight down like that down Pennsylvania and go Biden, Trump. It's a question of how far that line moves either this way or that way. Because you've still got big economic issues coming into the state. So the question that therefore brings is, right now, let's have a look at that question. This comes from Reuters Ipsos poll that happened, as you can see, on the 22nd. So what are we, we're 29th? It's a little bit out of date, but not by much. That little sort of grayed out blurry box is basically margin of error in terms of what those are. But it's interesting that the top two are realistically what you would expect to be talking about it in this current scenario with regards to actually seeing, apologies, I think somebody's question just came through. No. What you would expect with what's going on right now. Clearly, this is all respondents, and I was thinking about putting in here a scenario where I actually was going to show you the Democrats' response and the Republicans. You'll probably understand what it is quite clearly, but generally speaking, the two at the top are way out in front. Other is all sorts of random things. So you can almost remove that out of there. So there is a significant drop to the next thing, which is unemployment and lack of jobs, which you would probably actually somewhat feed back into the economy generally. The healthcare scenario is why the polls, why the pundits, why the market is probably now leaning towards a Biden election win. Healthcare is normally seen as a Democrat positive. You've got the Obamacare bill that's also possibly on the chopping block, and I'll come to the Supreme Court in a minute. You've then got the response about how the next president, whether that is the incumbent in Trump holds on or whether it's Biden going forward, how they deal with the COVID scenario in the US for not just the next 6 to 12 months, because some people will point out that might be how long it goes. It's longer than that. The fallout will be big. The mental health issues, the catching up of how many chronic illnesses and unknown illnesses in oncology, so cancer, heart attack, stroke, etc., that have been missed by this whole scenario. Healthcare is going to be a huge part of the US going forward. So it's not surprising that around about 18% of all respondents see healthcare as the #1 issue to go along in this election. But it's not far behind the economy. And remember, before this all happened, the economy was going pretty strongly. So this is the next part of it, and going on to that further question from the same poll. And again, why I'm doing this, I want to give you background about the thinking. I want to give you background into what will probably move the dial from particularly FX when the respondents are actually up on the dice, having their 2-minute chats, and then they're having their rebuttals and their Q&A session, is that according to respondents, these things are the things they want to hear about and what is causing them to vote the way they're voting. And it's not hard. We're all experiencing the same thing to some extent with what the US is doing, which is how do you get through the COVID-19? Now, the interesting thing about this question was all encompassing. It's not just the health crisis and dealing with a robust plan for COVID-19 health-wise. It's dealing with COVID-19 in general. It's about doing the health, doing the economic recovery, improving the public health service, making sure Medicare works. All of those things was all part of that question. And again, that's probably why the markets are leaning towards a Biden win. But you'd look at, again, the strong economy and restore trust in the government. This is a bit of an esoterical question and a debate, particularly the third one, because if you listen to Trump supporters, he's restored trust in the government, and they want him to go further. And if you look, and when you had, and if I had put them in here, I didn't need to, but if you click on the Democrats and the Republicans, the movement here isn't that huge in terms of the change of the top three. Now, when you click on the Republicans, the robust plan for COVID-19 drops down to third, strong economy first, restore government and trust it's second. In Democrats, the robust plan for COVID-19 is actually more around about 35 to 40% on respondents, so it brings it right back. The economy stays where it is, and then will restore trust in government is there, but not as strongly. It drops down to actually healthcare being above that, and then government. So the rest of it, civil rights, tough on crime, which have been buzz topics, have caused volatility, particularly in the dollar when we had the Black Lives Matter issue. Is interesting that it's fallen down the wayside about what's causing people to vote and what they're voting for. Environment, climate change, not surprising, it's falling down there. And then strong on immigration. In this current world where immigration is basically locked up anyway, nobody can move around, it's fairly obvious that that's clearly a moot point, but clearly some people still see it as that. And that would, that is a Republican response. Let's also put that out there. Plays very much typically into a Trump vote. And although it's only around about 4 or 5% of the voting population care for that, that is 4 or 5% straight to Trump. It's not, Biden doesn't really have any major policies at the moment on immigration, and that would therefore, you can clearly see that that's straight into him. What also you need to put at the moment, though, is where the country, according to the voter, is sitting. What is interesting is that we've just in the last week seen an uptick, and this feeds into Trump directly. We've known for basically most of this year that most Americans believe his handling of the crisis has been bad, that the direction that the country is on is not the way it wants to be. But there has been signs as the the big wave in the US comes off, as particularly states like New York, but also places like Florida, Arizona, Texas start to get their COVID cases down and back on track, we've started to see obviously a decline in that issue. It has built up slightly, but it is moving back down. And there is an uptick on that. And why I show you that is that, make no mistake, just like I showed you back here, sorry, apologies, gone too far. Just like I showed you here, the polls are actually tighter than what some people are expecting. And last week, the difference between the two candidates is actually now becoming a scenario where you could probably argue that it's now getting back towards a 50-50 race. And markets, particularly the US dollar, is starting to show that. But I'd also argue the S&P, the Dow, and the NASDAQ have also been doing things along that line and are actually becoming fairly stereotypical with movement to the idea that polls will narrow. And the more and more that Trump can do his thing, can get up, can rally the people, really energize his base, the Supreme Court clearly is also helping the movement that you're seeing on screen, because this is, a margin of error, the 3.1. If you're actually having a look at that, that's close enough to even when you add that back into to Trump's numbers there of 31.1. You could certainly make an argument to average that out, that they're touching each other on a positive thing for Trump and a slightly negative for Biden. Now, clearly it could swing the other way, I get that, but this is the closest that we've seen him get towards Biden pretty much through the big ramp up in the election itself. And it's the closest and highest level rating that Trump has had since the COVID crisis. And that is what's making this quite exciting. It's what's making the first debate tomorrow all that more interesting, because it's now, all bets are off and becoming quite a discussion. So the reason I've put this online with regards to how the debates work, they're set out, obviously the US does this beautifully, but the networks actually bid to host it. Fox won the first one. Chris Waller is the one hosting it, and he is a fantastic moderator, but it also means that he gets to set the topics. And these are the big 6 topics that he wants to talk about. So the candidates' records, he wants to do the Supreme Court, COVID-19, the economy, race and violence in our cities, and the integrity of the election. The interesting thing about the last 2 particularly is how that's been seeded and how that has worked with regards to particularly the Black Lives Matter issue, but also the mailing vote with COVID. So what I'm going to do, I will come to the first one in a minute through charts, because I think there's a really good way to look at this. But I do want to just quickly run through the Supreme Court and probably come back to this. Make no mistake, the unfortunate timing and death of the very great and very, very influential Ruth Bader Ginsburg has absolutely energized this poll. It is clear. If you look at if you look at Dixie, for those of you that are like me that have been watching this from a trade perspective, Dixie rocketed on the 21st. So last Monday, when all the news came out and they reopened, the risk around a Trump presidency built. You've got to probably, in this current market and this current cycle, see the US dollar as a counter risk currency. It's currently playing like that. You saw big sell-offs in Euro, Aussie, Kiwi, and also the pound. All the big risks in the G10. They got absolutely pummeled all the way through the week. Then the fact that you saw the Republicans use Ginsburg's death as a political movement to actually put in Amy Comer is also the next interesting thing around this. There's a question that I've asked about this, and there's a lot of political pundits much smarter than me asking the same question, is whether or not Trump may have actually missed a slight political play with this. Why I say that is that clearly the polls moved. It is a big conservative issue about the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is their highest court in the land. It makes incredible decisions around the Constitution, around interpreting law. It also has a fairly high possibility, according to some, of actually deciding the outcome of this election. And history has shown it's happened in the past. And again, we're talking about history today. So you can go back to 2000, Al Gore versus George W. Bush, Florida issues that actually end up in the High Court, well, in the Supreme Court in the US. And so appointing a conservative Supreme Court nominee judge would make it 6-3, and I'm sure you're all fully aware, it's been all over the news in that sway. It's been interesting that even what is seen as a moderate Republican in Mitt Romney has actually decided to go ahead with this. Why it's interesting, and why I say it's possibly a political miss, is that maybe Trump could have played this as an idea that the Democrats were actually blocking this going through, that they were being ridiculous. He's still the president, and if you want a conservative, stable, very, very even-handed, inverted commas, running of the Supreme Court, re-elect me as president, and I will get you that Supreme Court set up. I will not only guarantee a 6-3 scenario, but there's a couple of others in there that are actually at the back end of their careers. There's two conservatives and one probably liberal-leaning judge that may retire in the next 4 years. And he could have completely stacked the Supreme Court, and it will be something that he will campaign on, make no doubt about it. But having appointed the new candidate this week, there is a suggestion that he may be Mr. Trick, but either or, he's got it. And the way I'd probably look at it, you've now got a scenario where he has an advantage. If this becomes a bit of a hung scenario, you can go from there. Apologies, I just got a question coming in from Rafa. Yeah, so great question, Rafa. The question basically is straight out, who's better for the market? So I will answer that now, but I will also go through with it in a minute. So in answer to Rafa's question, in the short term, it's probably seen as a win for Biden, but over the medium term, there is a suggestion that it would probably actually be an easing. And actually, let's answer that question. I'll come back to this. The reason I come to this is getting the question around particularly Joe Biden's record and Joe Biden's principles. This here is what's happened in the main sectoral performances of the S&P 500. And I do want to really highlight energy there. Now, we know energy prices have been rapidly moving away, but in around about July, around about here, Biden actually started to talk around the Keystone project. If you don't know what it is, it's the big pipeline that goes through Canada all the way through down to Cushing's, which is in Oklahoma, which is pretty much one of, if not the largest oil supply supply hub on the planet. And he wants to actually remove that in terms of one of his first policies. He's also got a fairly high social agenda, possibly a slightly higher taxing agenda, which we're fairly certain is what's going to happen. So it may slow things down a bit. And therefore, that's the way I would answer that question, Rafa, to some extent. Trump, medium term, or at least 12 months, would be a positive. His economic agenda is clear. He basically wants to almost go along the idea that COVID's not happening and really ramp up the opening up, trying to get employment up as fast as he can, further tax cuts to come through to the system, stimulating as much as he possibly can. He's very much looking at corporate taxation is one of his big policies. But the other parts of that, Rafa, is we actually genuinely don't have more than that. Like, we have suggestions, we've had moot discussions, but in terms of actual physical understanding policy, we don't know. For both candidates, this is what's so interesting about this debate, is we don't know because both candidates are basically going at each other rather than actually giving you any form of policy, and it's sort of lost on that whole principle. And that's why the debate is going to be such a big thing, because we're now also discussing the economy. We're discussing the integrity of the election. Before I move off that, the integrity of the election is very, very interesting. It feeds into the Supreme Court as well, because we know the president is currently seeding this idea that mail-outs is fraud, that the mail-out balloting is fraud, that there have been hundreds of thousands of them found in dump bins that have got his vote on it, and then extra hundreds of thousands that have got Democrat votes, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The integrity of the election will be core. Does it, invigorate his base? Does it cause issues around race and violence? Probably could. How he handles it's a different question. It's how the election falls on the day, and this will be a topic when we come to this in the next couple of these seminars. We'll discuss that and go from there. But the integrity of the election is absolutely core to this, and how we go forward. Now, Tony's just come up. This is deja vu of the last election with Hillary v. Trump. Just can't see Biden having what it takes to win. Don't get sucked in by these same sham polls. The media did this last time. And it's a fair point, Tony. Completely agree with that. It's a fair point. Because polls are that. They are polls. And never write off incumbency. Never write off Trump's animal spirits. There is every chance that he can still win. I completely agree with that. They have, and I'll show you a few things that slightly are different this time around, but in the main, there is no doubt anything can happen in 40 days, and it will be much, much closer than I think the pundits are saying. It would surprise me greatly if what they call the blue wave was to happen. Biden wins the White House, they take over the House, which they already have, and they also take over the Senate. I just can't see it happening. There's just so much going on that's too close to do that. To get into this principle. So, Tony, I'm with you. I don't know whether or not he'll win or not, and I still, you've still got to go with what the market is telling me, and the market is telling me that probably Biden is the front runner. But I'm with you. There is every chance this not only comes down to the wire, but like last time, he wins out and surprises the pundits because he is that kind of personality, and he does it incredibly well. Just wanted to show you this. So this is the voter shift when you've got an actual debate. And what I'd probably highlight to you is that it does, in the main, move the dial to some extent. And you've got to look at it from the point of view that particularly, although I don't have up here the 2016 one, apologies, I couldn't actually get my hands on it because there was an argument that this is where probably Tony's point is perfectly on key, is that the expectation from the media, the expectation from the surveys and the polls, etc., was actually that Hillary won, and it shifted more people towards Hillary, but clearly that wasn't the case. So am I arguing against myself? Possibly, get that, and I hope by all means, I'll have that discussion with you. But if we do look at these here, going back to 1992, people's vote did shift after the debate, which is why it will be very interesting what happens tomorrow and how each candidate handles this. How, particularly from my perspective, how Biden goes through this. Biden's not a great debater. He can be a foot and mouth person. Trump embraces that. He knows that he is. He knows that he talks, he shoots his mouth off, but not only does he embrace it, he uses it to his advantage. Biden can't do that. And it will be very interesting to see how he does this. And do not be surprised. In fact, I'm odds-on favorite to suggest this will happen. Trump will go in. Trump will really try and push him, try and provoke him to make a stutter, but also to make him look like a ditherer and also to make him look indecisive. And he will run with that. What you'll see from that, and I know this from having watched the 2016 3 debates, is that the more and more that it looked like Hillary was almost mocking Trump and Trump was being dysfunctional, the market picked it wrong. And they were basically, every time that Trump was talking, it was being sold off. And then when Hillary spoke, it went up. I think it might happen the other way around this time. And what I mean by that is that if Biden dithers, if Biden can't handle Trump giving him a 1-2, you'll probably actually see this idea that the market will actually shift up on the possibility that Trump gets closer and closer to actually moving the dial. So it's going to be fascinating for that point. Now, just apologies, I'm just going to move this out of the way. If I don't answer your question straight away, I want to put that on there. Going back to a few other things that are also going to be influential on this is Trump's record. This is, again, all of the roll-up of the Reuters Ipsos polls, just again to show you a respondents. We know that his handling hasn't been great, but again, like what we've been seeing in everything else, is that it's starting to tighten up. And apologies, where's my mouth gone? Apologies, but you can see at the end there, you can see it's starting to actually come in. His disapproval rating for his handling is tightening up, which is what you would expect whenever you do these kinds of things. You should be having a scenario where you are tightening the polls. You should be having a scenario where you expect to actually see a movement around. Why are you doing that? Apologies, guys, just having some technical issues. you should be actually seeing a tightening in these polls. That's exactly what we should be seeing. And his rhetoric of the last couple of months about how he's handled it, his comparison to Europe, all those kinds of things. There are even, he does have some sort of point. The US isn't the worst on a per capita basis. It just isn't. And he's got a point there, and it's starting to actually gain traction. And that's why you're starting to see that movement there. The economy is obviously always has been his winning point, and it's starting to actually pull ahead in terms of Trump's record, even with what's happened this year and having record level unemployment, record level of benefits going out, the fastest US decline in GDP it's seen on record. All of that doesn't really matter, because you are starting to see that Trump's record on the economy is good. You've got to give him that credit, even if you don't like him. And it's starting to again become the factor that we knew it was. And his handling of the economy is seen better than Biden's. And that was Rafa's question, and why I came to this is that there is a belief for Biden's record, particularly with the possibility of who ends up behind him, left and probably what we would call quite left leaning politicians that will probably want to lean on him around the Social Security, Obamacare, so the Affordable Care Act, and also probably moving towards the US reintegrating, or at least re-engaging with the world around climate change, the Iran nuclear deals, all these kinds of other outside of what we normally talk about sphere. But it means that he's possibly taking his eye off the economy, which has been Trump's main thing. We know that he sits there and tweets around the charts that are on screen, which is the S&P making record all-time highs, the Dow making record all-time highs, the NASDAQ doing what it does, and then the other side of it is him talking about trying to get the dollar as low as it possibly can, and making America great again and driving the economy that way. It will be something that he absolutely hits Biden with between the eyes. And why it's so important for us as traders is that if Biden can't answer in a way that could be seen as even-handed, or even with the policies that he has put out there, that isn't going to be overly overly aggressive or overly heavy-handed on the economy, you are going to see a negative movement, and it's more likely to come in the S&P. So you watch your US 500 if you are trading that. You will probably see the futures move that way as they discuss their points, and that will be where Biden, I think, from a market perspective, will fall down if you are looking at him from that perspective, because he won't be seen initially. And getting back to Rafa's point as who's better for the market, there is a belief that he's probably a slight negative initially, and I do deliberately say that word initially, because as I said, 2016, the initial expectation and thought process was Trump getting in was going to be this catastrophic issue. The Biden scenario probably is the same as well to some extent. Excuse me, just having a glass of water. So what I also want to talk about is what's happened in history around trading and around movements with the USD. And there is quite an interesting scenario. On most hands, there is something that's very clear. Incumbency has a direct correlation to both the US dollar and also to US markets. If the incumbent wins, the US dollar tends to fall away. If the incumbent loses, it gains. And again, it's probably getting back to Tony's point, why for me, I'm probably leaning towards Biden winning, is that you also, if you have a look at 2008 is not a good one when obviously Obama came in, but if you have a look at what came with regards to looking at, I'd even go back to somebody like George W. Bush is probably the key one, in that he came in. You've got to remember it was a handover. So Clinton had done his 2 presidencies, but the Gore v. Bush presidency was going from a Democratic candidate and a Democratic administration to a Republican one. And it was clear as we got closer and closer, so those 90 days towards the election, Bush was going to win. And that's where they're saying that loss. It's the same also to some extent with what you're doing in 2016, that you had the end of the Obama era. Again, you've got the flip over. And as those polls got closer, getting back to Tony's question that he put to me before, you start to saw the idea that Trump was moving in there. The US dollar started to weaken away. And he did start to sort of see that interesting movement that you got this build up. The US dollar started to appreciate because that economic handover, the risk that was coming to the markets with a new administration, all that kind of feeds into it. And what I've put in that circle is that so far in 2020, as we've got with inside 60 days of the election, and now the election's becoming front and center, not so much COVID, it's just started to show signs that it's doing what it typically does when an incumbent starts to get to a scenario where he's going to lose. And that is the idea that Biden will win. And that is basically what most people are starting to base themselves on. It's not just the polls, it's not just the bookies, the market's doing it as well. And it's started to really show that it believes that the incumbent will lose. Now, the flip side to that is the same thing happens in the S&P 500, but in reverse. A rising market is associated with an incumbent's victory. And again, I will point out very clearly, I mean, unfortunately, 2016 is the interesting one. I should have, and I do apologize, I should have shown you what happened 3 days after this. And the kick up that once Trump got in actually happened. So again, because of who he is, because of how he works, he is a little bit of the exception to the rule. But everything else inside what happens on this chart, like with this one, is playing out pretty similar in terms of what you would normally see with the possibility of an incumbent losing. And I do deliberately say this, that again, he is the exception to the rule, and it could blow this all out. But again, looking at the trading on the screen, looking at the movements in the market, looking at the thought process, it is suggesting that Biden is likely to win. And therefore, the pattern that we've been seeing for most of it, 2008 is not a great example, clearly, because of the GFC. But 2000 is, you'd probably argue that also the handover to Clinton in 1992 after the end of the George Bush era is another good example of that whole principle. And then the other side of that is looking at Bush winning in 2004. You had the re-election of Obama in 2012. There's pretty clear acceleration. What's also a little bit hard, Donald Trump could be the first president since George Bush Sr. to have a one-term presidency. It's very, very rare, and that's, again, I would probably also highlight Tony's point, is incumbency is an amazing thing, and it's very, very, very rare to have a one-term president, even with his record, and that's why I would actually still think it's much, much closer than what we're being told and what the polls are saying. I truly believe that, and that's why we want to do this series and get you as much as historical information and then interpreting that where we can. I'm going to move quickly because I want to actually start getting you guys to ask me questions. I've got another sort of 10-15 minutes, and I know there'll be plenty of them. The other thing that's starting to happen, and I know this year is a weird one to be showing a VIX chart because obviously what happened back in March, and you can see that very clearly with what's going on, but the VIX is moving. They're moving the way you would expect. It is getting stronger. They're over history going back to 1928, but July, August, September, October, November tends to, on average, go from about 14 to 16 to 17 to 18, and actually at the start of November, we're normally in the 20s. The interesting thing is, according to this chart, obviously we're already there. We actually went through it. Now, I would actually probably point out and make the argument that clearly COVID is part of that. So you take the averages with a pinch of salt, but again, stereotypically, we're moving in the same direction that we should be, and that is the uncertainty of a new administration. Could be the original one, and therefore, inverted commas, steady hands hold true, or it could be a complete new direction for the country at a time when the country is clearly at odds with itself. It's battling a once-in-a-generation health crisis. You have, differential between the states like we haven't seen in many a year, and all that feeds into why VIX is moving this direction, and expected to do so even further. And this is what I'm going to finish on with regards to where I'm at, is getting back to that point around the way I've been looking at this, the way I personally, and again, this is just me personally, have been probably playing this is using the basket. Dollar index has started to show signs that the end of August was when COVID was starting to get a handle on globally. I know we're getting a second wave in Europe and it's becoming a risk issue and probably also feeding into this trade. And that's, to my advantage, I understand that. But it has been the idea that as we got closer and closer to the election, I expected after what has been a fairly dramatic drop in USD, let's also put that out there. I'm not saying this is the only catalyst reason, but the election is clearly becoming front and center for a lot of thought process. And that counter risk cyclicality that is the USD, in my view, is starting to play out. And that is what I'm now going to be watching for the next 40 days. Whether it goes back towards 97 is an interesting question. But the more and more the polls tighten up, the more and more that people start to make the assumption that, hang on, Trump could get back in. What does that mean? Do we particularly, and I'll discuss this over the next couple of weeks when we do the two more of these, what an actual disputed election could look like. And that's the part that's also starting to play into my thinking, that we could have a disputed election, and that we don't actually have a result on the 3rd of November. And that's a risk event in itself, and one that I think it's probably only about 15-20%, but that's enough. That's enough of risk to be looking at risk off trading, and that's what I think this is actually telling us. So I'm going to stop there for now. If you've got questions, please, on the right-hand side of your GoToWebinar control panel, type them in there straight away. I'm just going to remove Rafa and Tony's questions so that I don't double up on them. But if you've got questions, please put them in there right now. Otherwise, I'm just going to go through sort of a couple other things that came through. Other thing I'll say while I'm waiting for a couple of the questions to come in, guys, is if you are watching this from the record, don't be afraid to send those questions in to FP. They can send them through to me and I'll answer them at the next update. And we'll go over them from there, because the more we all discuss this, the more that we sort of work through what people are thinking, it gives you a clearer picture. And that is the one thing that I'm sure all of us have learned through our journey as traders, and our journey of those that watch FX particularly, is having that consensus thought process, or at least understanding somebody's differing point of view, just removes the issues of making mistakes. It understands what the other side of the coin is trading, excuse the pun, and why they might be long and you're short, and vice versa. And that's particularly what we wanted to talk about with regards to where we came with this going forward. So question has come through from Daniel. Okay, and this is, I was wondering if somebody would ask me this question. So Daniel's asked about gold and silver. Could gold and silver start to become a safe haven again with a falling USD? And his question specifically around spots. So he's got spot silver and spot gold against the USD. Great question. The interesting thing that probably got wrapped up this year, Daniel, around gold and silver was COVID, and what COVID was going to do economically to the world. And you saw that record all-time high that we got in gold and silver midway through the year when it peaked out. It has eased off. Does it become a safe haven? Possibly. I think you're probably more likely to see people moving into it because of a risk-off event. Will it be against the US dollar? I'm not so sure. I actually think the US dollar will, as I said, personal opinion, I could be wrong, and I'll put my hand up and say that, because it's just so hard to look through this at the moment. But I think the USD is likely to more continue to appreciate up further at the moment. But gold and silver will certainly probably start to see buying, in my opinion, if the risk of a disputed election starts to really come through, that we start to have states that may actually not have a result on the day, that Biden starts to falter, and therefore brings the Trump presidency in closer. All of those would be, risk-off events, and would certainly probably be part of movements in gold and silver. There are other aspects to it. I completely agree with that. But for me, I think the USD is more likely, in my view, in the short term, leading up to the 3rd of November, to probably more likely appreciate than come down. It might consolidate from where it is right now, because it's obviously had quite a decent run. It's up almost 200 points from the bottom it had in August. But in the history tends to show, and I'm going on history, that as we get closer and closer, and the risk event gets more and more acute, you'll go that way. Rafa's put through another one. Thank you for that question, Daniel. Any advice for equity traders that are trading this scenario for the first time? Okay, I won't say advice. What I would say is general principles and themes. I think what's happened in the last week and a half to a month in the US markets are probably showing that. The S&P dropped a correction. The NASDAQ dropped 14%. Now, some would argue, Rafa, that might be down to the fact that you've had such an incredible run in equities, and I understand that. But there is enough risk flying around with the possibility of a change of administration, change of direction, what it would mean for the economy, that there's just some money coming off the table. If you want to go into individual stocks, it's not that simple, unfortunately. So there are so many things going on. I mean, the one I would highlight that people always put to me is what you do with the FANGs, or even going closer and go into a Facebook particularly. That's the one to really highlight, considering, we've actually now seen a probable case being launched with their antitrust. So the possibility of breaking up Facebook makes it even harder to go that level in. So I'm more sitting on an indice basis here, that the volatility will be up. That is clear, and that's what this chart's telling us, Rafa. That will mean that you're more likely to start see what this is telling you is the market is starting to buy put protection, which means they expect more days of volatility, they expect more down days. And that's what I would probably argue to you, is that the market is expecting more declines. That's what this chart tells me. That's what volatility starts to do when volatility ticks up, is that they're worried that there are going to be coming down days. And that's probably the best answer I can give to that. It's not advice, obviously, but being aware, that's what we're doing. So we've got Rene's come through here. Capitalism is dead anymore, and more so market tanking if Biden wins. Would you agree or disagree? Look, it's a great debate, and I'd probably put it that way to you, because what is true capitalism is a great question, because at the moment it is being tested. I would agree with that. The political will to back up what was the theoretical capitalism that came out of the US through their industrial revolution and through the roaring 20s and what have you is clearly different. I wouldn't say it's dead, because they've just changed it. And what I mean by that is that I would probably argue that the US's capitalism is now the planet, and their biggest companies and their biggest drivers of their markets and their wealth is tech. And tech isn't bound by nation drawn on a map or by oceans. It's comes from the fact that the internet is global. So it's an interesting question. As I said, with Biden winning, there is a theory on a medium term, so sort of a 12 to 3 year basis, that it might be a slight sag because of believed policies. But as I also stated, none of their policies on both candidates, and this is Trump as well, are really there at the moment. We don't actually have a full, clear picture of rock hard policy. And so there's more an assumption that his left-leaning agenda may be a bit of a drag, but that might not be the case going forward. Just a bit further, Rafa followed up. Good, that was my next question. Are markets usually quieter during a debate or more volatile? Interesting question. They actually tend to be a bit quieter, which again was possibly because, getting back to some of the original questions that we've had, was I think there was particularly if you look in 2016 at the debates, there was expectation, because Hillary was expected to win so easily and sort of Trump was dismissed as a candidate, it was quieter. Now, I would argue this time around probably not. He has to be taken seriously. He really does. And the possibility of him being re-elected has to be taken as a real chance. So his comments this time will probably make a bit more of a difference. But you're right, Rafa, it's a good question. They tend to be quieter, but again, a question around the handling of COVID, a possibility of skewing the Supreme Court, and then actually getting into really quite narky questions around race, around the integrity of the election, could go anyway, and that could make it another question all again. Question here from Craig. From an equity standpoint, in brackets, with a long time horizon and bullish bias, I would have thought an increasing vol pre-election would present a good opportunity to sell covered calls with cash in a vol premium. Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I can't dispute that, particularly if you've got a long-term horizon. You know, if you look back at history, when you have had these increased vol positions, that strategy has worked. I completely agree with that. One of the best trading years when I was walking actually as a broker rather than actually doing trading was 2011, where writing covered calls all day was just, you know, inverted commas, and I'm not trying to put ideas in your head or saying this is, you know, the right thing to do, but it was money for jams because the volatility was just, you know, astronomical. When realistically, you know, I remember you were aiming to write covered calls on banks at $20 for $1, and they were $18, and the likelihood of them being touched was pretty low. So Craig, completely understand your standpoint. It's a very, very good strategy in the past, and one that could probably work going forward. Obviously, for those of you out there outside of Craig, because Craig's clearly quite a professional investor and quite a professional trader, just remember that all of these products have a level of risk and they can catch you. But yes, it's certainly one to be aware of. And great point. And what actually, before I move on from Craig, that's also what I want these to be. If you are out there and you've got a point to actually say, I will hand up, say, I do not know everything, and I definitely don't know everything. If you've got a really good idea, please put that in there. I want to read it out so everybody can know it, because the more knowledge we can transfer to each other, the better we are with this going forward. Oh, apologies. I just deleted a question that I shouldn't have deleted. It was started with if that was you, can you please retype it? Apologies, I hit delete and I shouldn't have. And I missed your name, but it started with if something. If you wouldn't mind rewriting your question, do sincerely apologize. I just hit that down. So again, this is coming from Peter, and he's put here, Evan, a statement rather than a question, and I'm glad this. There it is. Thank you, Daniel. That was you. Your research is limited to the mainstream media. Reuters is left wing. Your comment, the DC may possibly have higher taxing agenda. You're kidding. Unfortunately, timing of the demise of RGB, ideal would be closer to the truth. Installing a new judge to the SCOTUS is a huge opportunity not missed. You've shown your hand, Evan. Left is your priority. Fair enough, Peter. That's fine. If that's what you take out of this, then I understand that. I was hoping to sit here and trying to be completely apolitical, but apologies if that's how I've come across. Certainly wasn't trying to be, but fair call. That's fine. Understand that. Again, Daniel, sorry for originally kicking your question off. If one is looking at a long-term index fund with the strength of the pound and hopeful Brexit deal, is it is it fair to say the pound will strengthen the next couple of months? Daniel, must admit, I've actually backed away from looking at Brexit. And the reason for it is that the UK's issues around the handling of COVID has probably overclouded that. Now, I would agree with you, the last couple of days, in fact, there is growing signs that the UK and the EU are starting to talk and getting the deal done, but it gets completely clouded out with the fact that Parliament is in a shambles at the moment. Johnson is having incredibly hard times getting his own side of Parliament to agree on getting this. They clearly want to vote illegally on passing certain parts of the bill and not others, which has been signed off by the EU. So it's a volatile one, Daniel, in terms of what that is. The other thing I'd say, if you're looking at the pound, normally for me, I'd look at cable, so pound US. I personally think this is going to be a bigger factor in the very, very short term before we get towards the December deadline in Brexit. But I agree towards the back end of the year that will be there. Is there any other questions before I go? Because that's quite a lot, and it's It's 5 minutes to, and this has been a fantastic discussion, and thank you. So just last call for questions. If you've got any, please put them out there. Guys, if not, thank you so much for coming along. The next one we will do before the second one, which comes up on the 15th of October is the second debate. So we'll probably do it either the 13th or the 14th to give you time. And again, as I said at this, if you've got questions that have come out of this that you've just remembered, or if you're watching this from a replay, please send them into FP. They'll get them through to me. We'll go from there. Guys, have a great night. Thank you so much for watching. Look forward to seeing you, as I said, around the 13th or 14th of October. Otherwise, for all of you out there, please keep safe and see you soon.